Okay, so let's keep going now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sort of continue our discussion of, a little bit of sort of history of economic theory, but then we're going to kind of blend this in with, more direct, examples of environmental issues. Really what we discussed in the previous video, after that brief discussion about the Fullerton and Stavins piece on how economists see the environment, is to sort of kind of lay out in almost a way how much, the sort of foundation of economic theory, the history of economic theory, very much had an environmental blind spot, and primarily because of the economic theories that it tethered itself to, that ultimately promoted very, what we would call in the modern era, more supply side economic policy, where really the foundational goal of policy, if there is any, is to promote productive capacity manufacturing. And we've seen, in beyond the environmental problems of that particular perspective, we've also seen the economic, issues with that perspective as the U.S. economy has transitioned from a, 70% manufacturing economy, at the turn of, World War II, post-World War II, and then now we are, a greater than 70% service sector economy. And so that adherence to sort of a more supply side attitude has also perhaps brought, the overall, economic policy apparatus to be a little bit less cognizant of some actual issues. So beyond, the sort of environmental consequences of those perspectives, there also are economic perspectives with, what we might call not necessarily archaic, but sort of old economic ways of thinking, which, any science should develop itself over time and should develop new ideas and new ways of thinking, with respect to new evidence. And it is certainly the case with environmental economics and ecological issues, where, the way in which these issues became cognizant within, the economic way of thinking was for there to be an accumulation of evidence to suggest that, not only was economic growth putting strain on the sustainable behavior of the environment, but also that instead of treating environmental problems as sort of byproducts of economic processes and sort of, maybe you say, oh, well, that's a shame, but listen, we need economic growth, which is, again, that was sort of the best case scenario for economic awareness in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, at least amongst the conventional wisdom and amongst the policymakers at the time. Over time, of course, we learn, the folly of our ways, and environmental economics, I think, is a big part of that within economics. It's a discipline which says, look, we can still draw upon things and ideas and concepts that were developed a long time ago. There's really nothing wrong with that. But the problem with it is that you can't use, ways that are provably out of date, ideas that are provably out of date. You can't use those to further an economic and political policy apparatus which is clearly detrimental to a lot of people's lives. We'll talk about several, specific instances of environmental problems, which are move the conversation of economic efficiency into, well, what about, justice issues? What about moral issues? Some of these are about economic issues, and sometimes we're able to solve them with economic policy. But sometimes, the issue simply is that there are portions of our population which, for any number of reasons are ignored. And those populations, those marginalized populations, are also the ones that will be most affected by environmental problems. And, as a result of those marginalized populations, which, by the way, who specifically have less political power than the non-marginalized populations, who are kind of inflicting these individuals with environmental problems, they don't have the capacity to really change things and to improve their situations. There are political processes that can be triggered. There can be citizen-driven concerns over the environment, but there's a real weakness to that sort of response. In a perfect world, we would be able to predict environmental problems and we would, avoid them. right? That would be sort of the perfect world. It's far too much, I think, environmental policy tends to be reactionary. And then therefore there's already been this sort of establishment of damage. We're going to talk about in just a moment that basically you can think about environmental problems as reductions in the human condition and reductions in the state of humanity, that it literally causes damage, both monetary, in the sense that environmental problems often cause increased healthcare issues, which increase healthcare cost over the life of an individual. Also increase the healthcare cost of everyone else as well, who are even the folks who aren't negatively affected by the environmental problem. They will also see higher healthcare costs just by virtue of the way markets deal with private healthcare. And so beyond that, you also have the fact that, if someone experiences environmental damage, even if it doesn't produce long lasting health effects, it could have long lasting economic effects. If you pollute a river and that river has for centuries, supported agricultural life, first with indigenous populations and then later with, agricultural production that came afterwards. And then you pollute a river and that, reduces the sort of economic value of the river, then you've also messed with the economy. So you've not just caused a pollution problem, which we can, say is morally wrong, or we can say is just wrong generally. We can point to specific populations of individuals who are both, sort of economically damaged by pollution, but are also, non-economically damaged by pollution. This is one of the readings that I also gave you this week, was a paper that talked about intrinsic value of environmental amenities, right? That environmental amenities have this intrinsic value beyond, what we can use them for towards the economy. And if your market economy tends to view natural resources and the environment through the lens of, well, is it useful? It's going to tend to ignore the aspects of environmental, issues which are more intrinsic, right? And so that sort of, intrinsic value of environmental amenities and environmental resources is very real. And this is, of course, why in many countries, and including the United States, we have national park systems which set aside natural wildlife habitat and just land. It's interesting, I think, that the sell on the national parks in the United States very much was, we're going to set aside this land, but you can go visit it. So you'll still be able to take your car to it, but we're going to set it aside. We're not going to let them put McDonald's on it. We'll let them put McDonald's very close to it, but we're not going to let them put McDonald's on it. I just think that's a little interesting. There's a certain paradox with, a national park system. Like, you want people to enjoy it, but it's also at a certain point still a very anthropocentric view. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how even, within the environmental movement, there still is and tends to be a very anthropocentric view of policy and preferred policy and things like that. So one definite carryover from sort of established economic, early economic theory that we will definitely rely upon as sort of a central, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like a central, point to start off from. And that is that we're going to define things around this notion of social welfare. And we're going to specifically think about social welfare as coming from some what we call social utility function. Now, in economics, utility just refers to human satisfaction or human happiness. And the idea is that humans endeavor to do things, consumption, production, leisure activities, whatever, that we endeavor to do those things because they increase our utility. They lead to a more happier position than had we not done them. This is sort of an odd, way to think about things. Someone says, well, I go to work. I don't necessarily enjoy going to work. Well, the point would be that you went to work so that at a certain point you could then spend that money to enjoy things, or, so on and so forth. Or, when I pay my electricity bill, I don't enjoy that. It doesn't increase my happiness. Well, certainly having electricity makes us happier. And so, the idea is that, we can think about consumption as increasing utility, but we don't even have to just just keep it with consumption. Or we could more change the definition of consumption. So for example, let's say that I go and I want to visit a river, like we have here, in the picture. Let's say I want to go visit this river. We'll kind of work with this example throughout. This is the Dan River in North Carolina. It's very, very close to where my family first established themselves in the southern United States. My family actually first established themselves in Brooklyn, New York, and over by Gravesend. But after they left Brooklyn, they spent a little bit of time in New Jersey, and then they settled in the western portion of North Carolina, sort of right on that border between Tennessee, there along the Appalachian Mountains, and then of course what would later become the Smoky Mountain region of that area. So that's where my family's from. That's sort of the longest spell. They moved around a lot when they first came to the United States, but that was where they settled. And I myself am from Tennessee, but I sort of treat North Carolina as being kind of a second home for me. Anyway, let's say that I want to visit the Dan River in North Carolina, and let's say that I'm simply going to it to look at it. I'm not going to swim in it. I'm not going to fish out of it. I'm just going to look at it. Well, in a way, that's consumption. That is me enjoying something. So if we think about utility as being the outcome of consumption, and we just define utility as enjoyment or as happiness or even a satisfaction, we can get more cynical with it, and we can call it satisfaction, which of course that would enable us to then, sometimes in economics, things are framed around, it feels like we're catering to people who are able to make themselves happy, like people who have money. And again, like questions of paying electric bills and that's that level, that's not really consumption to produce utility. And so you can think about things in terms of satisfaction, just sort of some baseline level of satisfaction. But anyway, I think that calling it happiness is okay. I just wanted to acknowledge that, there's some interesting, I think, philosophical and moral questions about it. That being said, let's say that I go to the Dan River in North Carolina and I experience happiness, right? I experience utility. I get that dopamine injection in my brain and it makes me feel good. Well, I spent time looking at the river. So at the very least, I have made a trade-off. I could have spent that time doing anything else. Instead, I chose to spend it looking at the river. So in a way, I have made a human choice. I've chosen to enjoy something at the expense of something else. And in economics, we're very much interested in these sort of what we call shadow costs, which are costs which are not explicit. You don't pay them with money, but they exist and they're real, and we make decisions based on them. And this, opportunity cost, implicit cost, intrinsic value, all of these ideas which say that beyond the monetary connotation of economic goods or environmental amenities, there is this additional value that's hard to define. It's oftentimes very intangible, but we can point to instances that prove its existence. So the fact that someone would take their time and look at a river suggests that it is something to be enjoyed, right? That it has intrinsic value. Now, to take it a step further, I, in fact, likely did spend money to enjoy the river. I had to pay to put gas in my car. This is a river that you probably have to drive to. Had to buy lunch that day. So, we could look at the things that I spent money on. And again, so we can start to see environmental issues, even though there's this intrinsic value, there is often alongside it a real economic value. So if we're thinking about like national parks, people plan entire vacations around national parks. And in a sense, that's economic behavior being created by the maintainment of this natural resource, and stopping development on it. So it's not causing economic behavior to go away. It's just changing it. So instead of the economic behavior being developing the land, living on it, selling things on it, the economic behavior is instead taking time and expending resources to go visit it. That very well could be less economic, and probably would be less economic stuff. Again, going back to that idea of making economic stuff as being the purpose of an economy, we could certainly probably acknowledge that you get more stuff if you develop Yosemite National Park or if you develop the Smoky Mountain National Park. But again, you know, the idea behind the national parks is that they represent this intrinsic value that in a way goes beyond their monetary value. Now, you know, the Smoky Mountains is a great example here because at one point, more than 80% of the Smoky Mountains was in fact forested. Timber companies showed up in that part of the Appalachian Mountains and they took over. And for a long time, the timber companies had tremendous political power. And it really wasn't until people started to buy the land and conserve it themselves that we saw parts of the Smoky Mountains start to return to natural positions. They say that less than like 10% of all trees in the Smoky Mountains is old growth. So that's 90% of the sort of old growth was cut down. And now is newer growth, which, you know, I think there's something, you know, fairly sad about that. So in that context, when we think about utility and enjoyment and happiness, we can think about the social welfare function in several different ways. So we're not tied to a particular way. And we as a society sort of pick our social welfare function through the social contract, you know, through the democratic process of the policies that we choose and the way that we tend to treat each other. It sort of represents a social welfare function that we have sort of agreed upon. And it doesn't always have universal support, or it never has universal support, but, you know, your social welfare function can be, you know, very much reliant upon self-interest, which would be just sort of a utilitarian view, the top, the first equation there, which says that all we want to do is maximize social welfare. We're going to assume that social welfare is just everyone's happiness added up. So what we call social utility. And we're just going to assume that everybody cares about themselves. Therefore, just, you know, let everybody do what they want. And that's going to produce the happiness potential society. Right. Well, that's not necessarily reflective of reality. First off, we do care about other things than ourselves, right? So that doesn't capture, you know, the often the goals set out by most individuals. There are certainly some people who feel that way, who think that, you know, a very libertarian, everyone out for themselves, that's their preferred, or at least that's their stated preference with respect to, you know, how we think about the economy and political structures. But, you know, most people, we agree, you know, we care about other people. We have some level of altruism about us, and again, this goes back to that intrinsic value of you know, society, that intrinsic value of environmental things that is not has a dollar amount placed on it. It doesn't cost us anything. Maybe it costs us time or other resources expended to produce it, but it's there. We know it exists. So we tend to think about society as being more like a social utilitarian view, which is the second equation there. This equation says that my happiness is a function of my own happiness, but also a function of society's happiness. So I care about society as a whole, and I care about myself. And so in that sense, you can then start to develop, you know, justifications for like social safety nets, you know, welfare policy, progressive taxation, public education, environmental protection. You can start to develop more robust forms of the social contract as you make the social utility function more complicated and probably more realistic. The Rawlsian view, which is represented in the third equation, is more of a view of how we should as society carry ourselves. And what it says is that we should just base the social welfare, in other words, how we think about society, how we would rate society, so to speak, is we look at who is the least well off and we say that's society. And then the goal is to maximize their position. So you're constantly maximizing the position of the person who's least well off. And so your policies are going to be very social. They're going to be very reflective of, you know, helping the poor and helping the less fortunate. And so these would be very big social safety nets or outright, you know, non-market-based economic systems if you went to that further extreme. And so what you have here sort of in these three social welfare functions is sort of an increasing understanding or an increasing acknowledgement that beyond self-interest, there are things that we also care about. That we certainly care about ourselves and our own well-being, but we also care about the well-being of other things. We care about the well-being of society. And increasingly, I think we place the environment within that definition of society, right? So there's society, and we tend to think about that as people, but we increasingly are placing the environment as being a hierarchical, component of what we care about. So we care about society. That implies that we also care about the environment. So this brings us into sort of more normative considerations. So this is what you start to see develop in economics. So as we get into the 20th century, and especially post World War II, as microeconomics really starts to develop, and the quantitative methods of economics really starts to develop, and economics becomes more empirical in nature, what you have is more considerations of what we might call normative issues, which we talked about in the previous video, where we can look at everything from, well, the market created this, so it must be efficient, or we can start to have more normative considerations, which is, well, the market created this. Do we think that's good? Do we think the outcome is actually good? And we don't need to say that everything the market does is bad, and we don't need to say everything the market does is good. We can establish what things the market does well and what things the market doesn't do well. That is something very much that we want to do as much as possible. We also, again, we have a very anthropocentric view. So even environmental policy will tend to favor, sort of a very human view of the environment. And we're very myopic people as well. We tend to think about what is best for ourselves now. Even environmentalists, sometimes they're not as forward thinking as they could be. And there could be a much better way to craft environmental policy that, actually considers future generations more than it does now. And so myopathy that shows up all over the place, but very much humans are myopic, and our policies tend to be very myopic as well. And then again, this sort of notion of the social contract is imperfect. We all have a varying degree of preferences. We're all maximizing our own utility functions in our own distinct ways. And there's a lot of disagreement about policies. I mean, if you look at environmental policy, it's really one of the most contentious positions. It's become less contentious. Like overall, people care more about the environment than they did 40, 50 years ago, but it's still a fairly politically contentious subject matter. And so it's imperfect. It's very hard to craft environmental policy that makes everyone happy. And so as a result, there's this sort of winner and loser feel with environmental policy, where if you're a company and you do something wrong environmentally, we're going to punish you for it. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't. I think that if a company runs afoul of environmental policy, they absolutely should be punished in some way legally. But at the same time, again, that's a reactive approach, and it's not a very sort of forward-thinking environmental policy, because the forward-thinking environmental policy would do whatever it can to prevent that from occurring in the first place. And so again, even when we have strong environmental policies, a lot of what we'll talk about in this class will be, well, what are the problems with those policies? What do those policies tend to ignore? All with an understanding that it's hard to get environmental policy in the first place. So sometimes I think students get a little cynical and they think, well, what's the point of going through all these complicated economic models to talk about environmental policy when you can't even get people to acknowledge that climate change is real? And I'm certainly cognizant and concerned about that issue myself. But within the space of this class, and I think within the space of the broader environmental movement, there's a lot of room for these sorts of issues to be considered. So if we just sort of think about things a little bit more honestly, so this is kind of how we tend to think about the economic system now. So we acknowledge that there's a positive feedback loop in the economic system. So the circular flow exists. We just don't necessarily think the circular flow should be, what we think about, or what we are trying to maximize. That the circular flow exists. Consumption does seem to feed into production, but that shouldn't necessarily be the goal of society. Like we should use that fact. We should use the circular feedback loop of an economic system to make us happier and to increase human satisfaction in the human condition. But of course, the problem is that when you rely upon the circular flow for that aspect, the sort of laissez-faire view of solving the problem of the human condition, you are going to ignore those things which are spit out of the system. And so oftentimes environmental problems are spit out of the system because, again, the market itself does not have a good handle on intrinsic value. The market sees monetary value. And so the intrinsic value of environmental issues or the intrinsic value of a social fabric can oftentimes be ignored and violated by a market because the market simply is reacting again to kind of raw economic behavior, prices and costs and things like that. It's not considering the additional environmental cost of a particular problem. So a more honest view of the circular flow is this, where, you know, we acknowledge that the circular flow, you know, does create economic growth, but it spits out some pretty bad stuff and stuff that we should very much concern ourselves with. And potentially, by the way, things that eventually could cause a reduction in economic growth. If we use a resource that is important to us and we overuse it in an unsustainable way, then it's gone, and it actually may curtail our future economic growth. And so we should very much be concerned about sustainable, you know, resource use and the propensity of markets to not behave in that way. One of the things we'll discuss later on is this concept called the tragedy of the commons, which is our acknowledgement that markets will tend to overexploit you know, systems when there is a scarce or potentially extinct you know, resource, such as an animal or, you know, even something like water can be unsustainably used and things like that.